Welcome to this live follow-up to the video that I made about information, essentially. I think the title was around belief, and that may imply that when I'm talking about beliefs, I'm talking about something that is deep and intrinsic and fundamental to someone, their ideology, their faith, etc. I'm not specifically talking about that here, and wasn't in terms of the video that I made, and I will explain a bit more about that video. The beliefs I'm talking about are more what I have called in the past utilitarian, those beliefs that allow us to function in the world and allow us to make predictions and also to make decisions about what we should do. So from the video that you may have watched already, what I was talking about was a clock which is in Edinburgh in Scotland, and it's a clock which is a turret clock, and it's on top of the Balmoral Hotel. And essentially that hotel, it used to be called the North British, and the North British Railway Company requested that the North British Hotel put that turret clock forward. So it was essentially 3 minutes fast. So when you looked at that clock, it looked like the time was 9:23, when in actual fact it was 9:20. And the reason that was done was because people would look at that clock and they would think, hold on a second, I'm maybe late for my train, or I better speed up. And initially, at first glance, not always just at the clock, but at first glance, in terms of that story, it sounds potentially a little bit odd, a little bit twee. Maybe that's not what happened, but as far as I'm aware, it did happen, and it does happen present day. But when they changed the time on the clock, it was 1902, I believe. And of course, people didn't have access to the number of devices that can tell them the time these days. And as far as I understand it, the portable watch, whether it was the pocket watch, the wrist watch, was not that common, and I think they were also quite expensive. So what would people do as they went about their business? They, in the centre of that town, or when they get closer to the railway station, would look up at this clock. That was the source of information for a lot of people about how fast or slow they were running in terms of the schedule. And as I said in the original video, I think this is like a really good idea. I think the intent behind it was altruistic. And to this day, the clock, as I've mentioned, is 3 minutes fast. I think that it went into disrepair. It needed repair during the lockdowns, and I believe that it then couldn't be repaired, and so it couldn't be made functional for the new year. Because as an aside, I didn't mention this in the original video, at the new year the clock will be set to the real time, Greenwich Mean Time, and the reason being, of course, so that people could celebrate the bells. Otherwise, they would be celebrating at 3 minutes early and wondering why on their mobile devices, people in another town or even in another location in the same town wouldn't be celebrating the new year at that point in time. And of course, it's meant to be a thing that people do together. So that being said, and with a focus on the fact that I believe that the clock being fast was altruistic, the decision to make it, to set it fast, was altruistic, that can also backfire, which I'll come on to, in terms of backfire against the population. And it also is a metaphor, an analogy for present day. Because if you think about it, if you imagine wandering about that town, that city, and being in the vicinity of that railway station, then the information that you were getting was from that clock. And the information that you had available, for a lot of people at least, was probably only from that clock. Yes, you could ask a stranger and say, do you have the time? Maybe you could find a shop window. Could you trust that time on that particular timepiece, etc. So this was an important piece of public information that was being broadcast by light. We're seeing it. And that then meant that it influenced quite a lot of people's behaviours, or it could. Even if they knew it was fast, they would go, oh my gosh, I'm running late. Hold on a second. No, I've got an extra 3 minutes. Maybe I've got time to pop into that shop before catching that train. Not a good idea. I'm one of those people who likes to get places on time. I don't like being late, so I'm really happy with that clock being fast. In fact, if I set a wristwatch, it's normally fast. It is never slow. And if it starts to go slow for whatever reason, I'll always set it a bit fast. So I'm happy with that arrangement. I'm happy that that was done. But as I mentioned, this is like an analogy. It's a metaphor for what we have present day. Because if you think about who is or what are the sources of information, for we understand what is going on, the understanding of time is quite fundamental. The understanding of a relation to the shared time of fellow citizens is quite fundamental. If we're running half an hour late all the time, then it could cause us some real issues, particularly if we believe that we're on the same time as everyone else. So when we consider the clock as being a broadcast of information to the populace, then I think fairly obviously we can look at present day and consider those sources of information that we receive. And these days, there's 24/7 coverage. I mean, some people have talked about, if you tried to keep up with what is available in terms of information, it would be a little bit trying to drink from a broken fire hydrant. We'd get overwhelmed. We'd be choking. We need to get out of that stream of information to gasp for air. That it would be dreadful. And if you've ever done that to a degree, if you've ever accessed social media, mainstream media, etc., then one can become overwhelmed. And you can easily spend all day, if you so desire, and I think not a good idea, but if you so desire, you can do it. And again, if you've ever done it for periods of time, you can find yourself swamped. And within that, there will, of course, be information which isn't true. Sometimes that information is not true because people have misunderstood what they've seen. It's been misreported. The word of mouth, the story that's been told hasn't been true, or has been exaggerated, or details have been missed out. In other words, it can be a series of honest mistakes or an honest mistake. But in the mix, of course, we have people who are the so-called bad actors. And I don't mean someone who's been in a pretty rubbish film with a bad plot which is badly acted. I mean someone who has intent that is not good. In other words, the clock was set with good intent, set fast with good intent. But some people with bad intent want to stir things up. They want to spread information which isn't true. And these people, well, it could be the types that go around on social media and just try and create disruption for the sake of it. And they seem to enjoy that slightly, I don't want to call it anarchistic, because that's giving them almost a compliment, disruptive effect that it can have. They like to see the perturbations in the system and how people can get confused and befuddled and upset and maybe even quite badly affected. And to me, that is not nice, and I'm putting it politely. So some people will just go and spread a lot of nonsense because they think it's funny. But some people want their agenda out there. They want their agenda to be present, and they want their agenda, and what I mean by that is their version of reality, to reach you, to reach us. And that can come in the form of the narrative that everyone has got to be aligned with. And there'll be a particular story, which very often is connected to attempting at least to get us to think about situations and people, individuals, groups in certain ways. We're being given a narrative, a story about how we should look at the world, how we should consider this group, how we should consider this situation, how we should think about this individual. And maybe you can consider groups, people, individuals that may apply to. Maybe you can consider what that might mean to you right now. And sometimes it is difficult for us to consider that because most of us are quite trusting in nature, and most of us want to believe that people are, by and large, altruistic at their core. And most of us want to believe that people are doing things to help us for our benefit, and that the world is cozy and it's nice. And unfortunately, as I'm sure you'll be aware, it isn't all the time. And I don't wish to suggest that we should become cynical. Sometimes we have to be. But what I do suggest is that we need to become cautious, because just like the clock, how do we know that it's not set 3 minutes fast? In other words, how do we know that it's not giving us the wrong information, information that isn't true? And as I've already said, there are some people who will attempt to give us information that isn't true and give us opinions and just disrupt things because they think that's fun. They get some kind of kick out of it. But there are also people who, very often with a reasonable amount of money behind them, will attempt to coordinate how we think and how we should consider, as I've said, events. And if you stop and pause for a moment and don't stick your head in the broken fire hydrant because it becomes overwhelming, but cast an eye over some of the stuff and some of the headlines that you're presented with, it's very often quite evocative, because that's how some newspapers sell their product. And it's also, of course, how some people will sell the message that they want to put over on social media and other medias as well. And you can understand that, and that is an opinion, which is fine. But we've got to be careful that if we get too many opinions which are aligned and therefore accept them as fact, that we're not buying into something which isn't actually true. And I told the story about a couple of IT people who tweaked this, one of their colleagues' emails so that what he was receiving was not quite reality. Now, I must emphasize that the tweaks were very subtle, but the tweaks were just enough in terms of emails that were being received to this male colleague from someone else. They were just enough to make this male colleague think that this other individual liked them. And it was, it was done, I genuinely believe, because these two IT folks thought it was funny. And as I mentioned in the other video, it broke all sorts of rules and regulations, and I think ethically and morally was wrong. But I at least can see the IT people's perspective, and having heard a little bit about them, I do believe it was meant to be light and funny, but it was the wrong thing to do. But because of that, it dawned on me, it suddenly dawned on me at that time, how vulnerable we all are to not as much receiving emails that have been tweaked and tampered with, because most of the time, thank goodness, that isn't happening to any of us, but we are receiving information, we're receiving messages. And what I was attempting to get to in that earlier video about the subject was that it is so important to have channels of communication that don't rely on big organizations, or don't rely on organizations which can control that narrative, that can curate what we're seeing and hearing. And if you think about it, let's take the so-called mainstream media. if you went to France and you can understand French well enough to understand the news, then I think it's fair to say you would probably get a bit of a different perspective on what was happening in the world. Would you not? Nothing sinister about it, just local knowledge and a national perspective. So people that we may know, for example, in a soap opera, they might never report about. You might think, I wonder how so-and-so's doing. Whereas it might be that big news in the tabloid here about this soap opera actress. But over there it wouldn't be. And there may be a focus on what was happening in the middle of Lille, and we wouldn't hear about it here. And of course they would have a perspective on the UK that maybe is different from what we're hearing and seeing here. And so of course things are curated. They're curated all the time. And another obvious one would be to go to the United States right now and look at the coverage. Although we do get a fair amount of it here, partly because of the upcoming election. But some of it would be, well, at least for me, would be different from what I'm getting exposed to in the UK. And so we have that level of things being curated. And as I've suggested, that's not necessarily anything sinister at all. But it is worth considering that what we get in a snapshot of a news report that's either online or direct on TV is curated. It's like, okay, you've got half an hour to tell us the news from the whole world. Really? Is that possible? Of course it's not possible. So the whole thing is stacked, and we're being fed what people in the media think is of interest. Now, could there be some, let's say, bias in there? Well, of course there is. Of course there is. And hopefully it is still not as biased as some countries. I don't think it is. But in some countries that I won't mention, things are quite restricted, and we're lucky in the UK and indeed in the US that we are able to access things which give us different opinions. But still, it is not everything that's going on in the planet. And are some things censored? Yes, no doubt they are. One always hopes for good reason, security, etc. And that doesn't mean to say that there aren't a lot of good people working behind the scenes to ensure that we get as fair and open and honest a rendition of what is happening out there as possible, given some of those restrictions. But still, within that, there will be influences, there will be biases, as I've mentioned, and there will be a promotion of some stories and a diminution of other stories. So it's still far from perfect. And then you go online, and what do you get online? And once more, you will get let's call it a collection, is probably the best way I could describe it, of individuals and groups who want to tell us things their way. I'm doing that right now. I'm giving you my opinion, and that's all it is. It is an opinion. But I don't have billions or millions of dollars behind me, and there's no slick advertising, and I don't get talking heads in to justify what I want to say, to add to the narrative that I want to put out there. Quite the reverse, actually. I like to speak to people about things that I don't know much about, and also who may have a different opinion. I think that's very healthy. But we don't see that much of that out there. It does happen, which is great. So I don't really mean to paint this as doom and gloom, but ultimately what I'm getting to is that some of the platforms on which we dialogue, we interact, we post and we share, and we access the posts and shares of other people is curated. And some of that, again, is with very good intention. There are limits in terms of what can be said, and there are certain behaviours and images which shouldn't be shown. And I agree with that. I wouldn't want to make anyone think that I believe that it should just be a deluge, because what horrors would we see and hear? So someone somewhere, a group no doubt, makes decisions about what can be seen and what cannot be seen, what can be said and what cannot be said. But, this is the issue, the caveat, the warning. As I've mentioned, the clock broadcasts the information about the time, again, broadcast via lights that we pick up when we look in that direction. It broadcasts that information that is wrong, but it is wrong deliberately, and it was done for altruistic reasons. And also one could argue for business reasons, because people catch the train and they're pretty happy and they go back again. So it doesn't mean to say there's not a business rationale to that, but by and large, altruistic reasons. But suppose these reasons were not altruistic, suppose they were done for another reason, and suppose that the only source of time that we had, or a big influence on how we perceive time or information, was that clock. And that clock, as it was controlled by a company. And so much of what we see is controlled by big money, big corporations, with the agenda of keeping us on those platforms, because we're the product in that sense. It's our attention on the adverts. That's how they generate it. So it's going to be safe and happy and edgy to a degree, but they want us there. But also there are, let's say, forces at work. There are corporations at work who want to make us buy the products or want us to think in certain ways. And that money and those messages, whether it's directly, whether it's subliminal, whether it's conversation, whether it's talking heads, can influence how we think. And ultimately, what we say is curated, or what we're allowed to say is curated. Now, is any of that bad, ultimately, at this point in time? I think we're still in a position and in a place where it's okay. It's livable with. However, if you then think about the clock, to go back to that, and if someone didn't know the time, they could ask someone else who had a watch. Or they could ask someone who would say, well, that clock is 3 minutes fast. And in fact, you could probably ask quite a lot of people around that train station at that point in time, and they would tell you that's 3 minutes fast. And of course, what we're able to do in that situation is to communicate to someone directly. And therefore, to get to the, I suppose, the denouement, it is, back to France, it is important for us all to be able to communicate directly. If everything that we do and say is curated through a big platform, then that platform controls what we can do and say, what we can show, what we can talk about, the information we receive, what we can send out. And if that is done properly, then it is not a bad thing. But how do we know it would be done properly? And how will we know going forwards that it will be done properly? There are more and more signs that what is happening behind the scenes in terms of the algorithms and what can be said, what can't be said, is being monitored more closely, and certain things won't see the light of day. And the issue is, and again, I'm trying to be very fair with this, the issue is that that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I believe that some things should not reach the eyes and ears of children, for example, of course. But what I'm saying is, if we put all our faith and confidence into organizations which are there to generate profit, remember, that's why they're there, then we leave ourselves vulnerable to only ever having the narrative, the message, the messages from the source of information, the clock that's broadcasting. In this case, some of these platforms, social media platforms, and indeed so-called mainstream media. Therefore, the ability to speak to someone in the street, to use that as the metaphor, to say, hey, what is the real time? Oh, well, actually, it's not that time up there at all. It's this. And if you look at the other signs, like the sun, if you can see any. The shops are still closed, etc. If you look around, you can see that that time is not accurate. And we need that ability to access people directly, to be able to talk one-to-one. And this could be done online. But what I was finishing off that previous video saying was, it is also important to be able to talk in person. And it is also important to be able to gather in groups to talk in person, to have the ability to say, what do you think of this? I'm not sure about that. Or to have differences of opinion, because it's far easier, I think, in many ways, to have a difference of opinion with someone and figure out what it is and walk away very often quite happy at the end of it than it is online. Because quite quickly online it can escalate, it can be misunderstood, the way that we communicate online, whether it's messages, whether it's emails, whether it is, and I'm thinking here in terms of groups, by the way, then it can go badly wrong. Because if you post something, then there'll be one group, let's say it's on X, there'll be one group who think that and another group who think the same as you. And it can quite quickly become a bun fight. And I think in person, yes, it can also become a bun fight, but it is easier to connect with the individual from a sort of human level. It is easier to pick up the humanity and say, hey, we disagree, but what is the truth here? How can we find what the truth is? Because that's what we're both after. And that slightly, in its primary sense, Hegelian approach, I think, is essential, and that is easier done. Now, why am I saying all that then? Well, because we're seeing in some countries, including the UK, more and more the application of this word hate and what you can say and what you can't say. And as I said in that earlier video, I'm all for not stirring up, not inciting certain things. Again, I've got to be careful of the wording that I'm using here, because I hope that you get this message. So not inciting certain things. And why wouldn't you want to agree with that? That's absolutely the case. But if you look at some of the proposed legislation that is around, and if you look at what is actually in place, as far as I'm aware, it still is in Scotland, then you have a so-called amendment or introduction of a particular hate crime bill, which means that if you say something in your own home and you are, or let's say, around a table and someone says, oh, I think that's like a hate crime, I'm going to call the hotline, then the police have a duty to investigate. And you didn't get a chance to explain yourself. And even if it's found that, well, that was an honest mistake, as far as I'm aware, again, allegedly, so I'm not trying to give you a false narrative here, as far as I'm aware, that would still appear somewhere on your record. Now, as I said, I made a video about this. As I said, I think the intention is laudable, because we don't want people inciting all sorts of things, but the ham-fisted and frankly scary nature of the wording, because it is so nebulous, should be repealed. And at the moment, because we seem to be getting hit with one major news story after another and everything is in a state of flux, again, as far as I'm aware, that hasn't happened. And it should be removed. And the reason that I say that is because if what we're getting online is, let's say, questionable, and if we cannot say what we think online, and if we cannot find a platform to reach a group or a group to reach us, where it isn't simply propaganda, and we are interested in getting to the truth, which I think is so important, if we can't do that there, then in person is the place. In a gathering, one-to-one. And of course you can talk one-to-one online, you can talk one to a few in some, we're using, for example, let's say Zoom. So you can do that. So I'm not saying that isn't possible. And I don't know how well that's curated. I don't know what they do behind the scenes there. But anyway, back to, so to finish this video off, back to this in-person stuff. So how we learn, how we socialize ourselves is by saying things out loud. At least that's part of it. And someone says, you can't say that. And someone says, hold on a second. What you said is actually offensive. Or in saying that, have you thought about how someone else might feel? And then imagine that if that was you, you'd probably go, oh, I didn't mean to offend anyone, or I didn't understand how that came across, or I'm just voicing my opinion. And then someone else may challenge it, and if you can, which I always recommend, remain calm, seek the truth together collectively, then you can unpack, you can uncover what the reality is, and you can understand and get a greater understanding of why you may have been wrong, or indeed the other individual gets an understanding of what you meant when you said it. And we're all enriched by that. That's an enriching process. And for younger people, it is a socialization process. It's how they understand. It's how they make sure that they do not misstep and do anything wrong or something wrong out there. And I think, therefore, when you have a group together, if you cannot then say that privately, whatever it may be, that's a mistake, or you're testing it, or you're being a bit facetious, or you're just stirring things up because you want to see the reaction, but you learn from it, and so do other people. If you don't have that learning process, that socialization process, then you are at risk of not only clamping down on the people who are adults, and young adults, older adults, but particularly the younger people don't learn in the same way. They clam up. Maybe it drives certain thoughts underground, so we don't know what is going on. It is dumb, as I've said, that law, the way it is structured, if it still is there, but I think it is ham-fisted, and it is dangerous. And what it also encourages is people to go, oh, I'm telling on you, I'm going to call this number. Even if what you said was innocent and it was obviously meant to be a joke, and also even if you did nothing, but this other individual decides that you should be punished because they're just mischievous or they don't like you. And that is straight out of 1984. That's Orwellian. So what information are we getting from the clock? What information do we get online? How can we discern? Critical thinking is key. I'm not going to get into that here, maybe another time. And also, I think that it is so important to speak to people. Again, this can be online, but not necessarily via social media, although that it's still a good thing, still serves a good purpose in moderation. Not only should we do that, but we have to have the ability to talk one-to-one, and we have to have the ability to talk in a group, a big group, a small group, a gigantic group, or just 3 people. And we have to be able to speak freely. Now, the argument is that if people sit and everyone, let's say they hate the oh gosh, trying to think of something that isn't offensive. You see, let's say that they dislike trees. So they dislike trees and they talk about it. Again, trees is a metaphor, analogy for whatever you want to think it to be. Then the argument is that they could just fuel each other up and it becomes an echo chamber. That's absolutely true. And they go out there and they damage trees. They say bad things about trees and they fuel their fantasy about how bad trees are, because trees aren't bad, of course, at all. And so to stop that happening, some people say, in defending that law, that you can stop what they say in those private dwellings and in those private conversations, but of course you can see the flaw, right? If everybody's bought into not liking trees, they're not going to say anything. You don't do anything about that. The way to tackle that stuff is to be an open, honest conversation, as I've said, when people are interested in finding the truth and reach a consensus or a disagreement peacefully about what that truth may be. But I come back to that word, it enriches. And so I don't think trying to clamp down on things that way works. I think it drives it underground. And I think that attempting to suppress the learning process, the socialization of what can be said by some clunky, ham-fisted bit of legislation is tantamount to, ultimately, if we're not careful, if people do pay attention to the hotline, so to speak, and start telling on people, then it's tantamount to, in part, well, let me be again, not too flowery in terms of the language, a desocialization, a dissocialization, certainly a disbenefit to the learning process, to the development of particularly younger people. So where do we get our information? Well, everywhere. How can we trust it? We go and see if we possibly can. We look for ourselves. We talk to other people. We get different opinions. We talk to groups. And as long as we're not inciting stuff, then we should be allowed to travel where we want, to see what we want, to find out for ourselves, to investigate, to talk one-to-one, and also to talk in groups. And hopefully that makes some sort of sense, and it's not meant to be too out there. I just think the direction of travel, if we're not careful, is potentially tricky for a lot of us. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. For the moment, from me, bye for now.